Chapter 6. Into the Breach. Once more.
Janowaski, get up here and help me with the door,
the gunnery sergeant shouted to the young corporal. The corporal hustled up to the door and pulled out 2 wrecking bars from his backpack. DeStefano held up his hand, and Janowaski tossed him one of the wrecking bars. The 2 men plunged their respective wrecking bars into the door jamb.
On 3,
he said while holding up 3 fingers. Janowaski nodded in accordance with the gunny's request.
1, 2, 3,
he said as both men leaned back and mustered the strength to pry the door open. Both men were outstretched as far as the bar could bend. The wrecking bars simultaneously snapped like a mad dog snarling at a male person. The 2 operators looked at each other with a certain level of astonishment and pride. The rest of the team found it an opportune time to heckle, hoot, and holler.
Now what?
DeStefano asked. Breacher rounds? Janowaski asked.
Breacher rounds,
Whitaker said gleefully. Whitaker smiled and pulled out a box of experimental titanium breacher rounds from his backpack. The sergeant ejected his magazine, and Whitaker handed over the box of ammunition. He loaded up the magazine with an experimental rounds. It wasn't often that the sergeant got to experiment with new weapons. He was as giddy as a pothead eating a box of Girl Scout cookies outside of a medical marijuana dispensary. The sergeant slammed the magazine into the rifle and pulled back on the charging handle. He handed the rifle over to Whitaker to breach the door. Whitaker held the rifle waist level and shot from the hip. "Okay, boys. Let's see what these things are made of," he said and blasted the door.
Clack, 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 clack.
Whitaker suspended his barrage and handed the rifle back to the sergeant. The sergeant grabbed the rifle back from Whitaker and slung it back over his shoulder. He pointed both of his fingers up and then at the door. DeStefano and Janowaski both charged the door like linebackers going after a quarterback. The door snapped off the hinges and flung into the next room. Janowaski lost his footing, and the door took him into the next room. Like a kid riding a newly wedded slip and slide, DeStefano stumbled to the ground, face planted into the fresh pool of blood. Lindell immediately raised his weapon to put some light on the entrance to the biolab. To his great surprise, the facility was immaculate inside. The men were shocked by the nearly pristine and unmolested biolab. DeStefano cautiously crept into the cavernous room. He carefully scanned the room, making sure to step over Janowaski in the process. DeStefano was feeling charitable and kneeled down to the corporal and picked him up off the ground. DeStefano glanced back at the stairwell and motioned over to the squad.
"Coast is clear."
The squad quickly infiltrated the unoccupied biolab. Mike instinctively grabbed some glow sticks from his backpack and started scattering them about the empty biolab. The men scanned the room for some kind of clue. Janowaski picked up on a faint trail of blood-stained footprints. The trail led to a pile of manila file folders scattered across the laboratory floor. The white porcelain tile floor shined the green glow from the glow sticks. Janowaski squatted down to pursue the file folders. As Janowaski was thumbing through the file folders, he couldn't help but wonder what happened. "Find anything?" Allen inquired. "Whatever they were looking for in this mess, they sure ended up leaving in a hurry, sir." Janowaski seditiously started tossing aside folder after folder, like a monkey discarding a banana peel. Bingo. Here we go, boys," he said. Janowaski found the proverbial needle in the haystack. He held up a folder with a big fat red "Confidential" stamped across the outer folder jacket. There was a broken red plastic seal that once contained the folder. The plastic seal was covered in bloody fingerprints. The corporal tossed it over to the first sergeant for further inspection. "What do we have here?" the first sergeant asked while auditing the folder. The sergeant's casual view of the folder turned chthonic with each preceding flip of the page. The sergeant closed the file folder and bent it under his armpit. He began to pace back and forth, pondering his next move. "What is it, Sarge?" Whitaker impatiently implored the indignant sergeant to inform the ignorant squad of the important intel. The sergeant pulled open the folder to expose a photo of the chief scientist responsible for Project SSS-1. It was none other than the retired lieutenant colonel. Whitaker stood resolute as his prior, seemingly paranoid state was now thoroughly justified. Who else? Who else?
Ha!
Hernandez started laughing out loud. I can explain, the colonel pathetically pleaded with the pissed-off squad. Says here that not only did you head the research project for SSS-1, you were working on a gain-of-function research to make it more transmissible to humans.
Well, yes, but...
While the rest of the squad was bickering, DeStefano was looking over the trail of bloody footprints. He was fixated on the crimson boot prints. He had seen it before somewhere, but couldn't immediately recall where. The wheels were churning in the gunnery sergeant's head for some kind of remembrance.
I recognize these boots, he said slowly.
DeStefano popped up from his squatted position and started looking for more clues. DeStefano started searching out the remainder of the floor. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he felt he was hot on the trail of something. He was rummaging around like a hound dog hot on the trail of a pheasant.
Sir,
Sergeant Allen looked over to the distraught gunnery sergeant. The gunnery sergeant roamed off the beaten trail, about 20 or so feet to the corner of the laboratory. The biolab was a labyrinth of desks, science kits, and cabinets, almost like one of those cornfield mazes. The sergeant shined a light over to the gunnery. The gunny calmly held up a set of dog tags. He held the dog tags in the air and they dangled against the gunny's forearm. He quickly flung them over to the sergeant, and the sergeant snatched them out of the air.
I recognize those boot prints, sir,
the gunny explained in a distraught tone. The sergeant found this claim to be somewhat outlandish, but still trusted the gunny knew what he was talking about. Who else but the gunnery sergeant would comprehend that level of granular detail?
Those are the men's forced entry tactical waterproof boots, sir, he explained.
The squad looked over at DeStefano, waiting for some further explanation. Hernandez had slung his rifle over his shoulder and rested it behind his neck. Hernandez needed to take a breather. The fatigue was beginning to take its toll on the operator. "Speak on it, Gunny," Allen shouted.
"Standard issue boots for the NSF,"
he explained. Mike was taken aback by his discovery. He immediately clammed up and straightened his back up like the first time a nun slams a ruler on your desk in Catholic school. He looked down at the dog tags. The tags were mangled, almost like someone had digested them. "You're saying these dog tags belong to an NSF squad?"
"Sir, yes, sir."
The sergeant immediately turned to the retired lieutenant colonel. He stuck out the dog tags and began to berate the colonel. He was hoping to get some kind of authentic response from the colonel, but wasn't going to hold out for hope. The sergeant grabbed 2 executive leather chairs and faced them off in the middle of the room. The sergeant sat down in the first chair and motioned Janikowski to delicately place the colonel in the other. Janikowski instinctively picked up the sergeant's subtle gestures. "Colonel Johnson, you got some explaining to do," Mike said while pulling out a loose cigarette from his badly damaged cigarette carton.
"I see. It is finally time to cut the Boy Scout routine, Sergeant,"
the colonel asked defiantly. The sergeant smiled and said, "Made it all the way to the Eagle, actually." The sergeant took a long drag from the cigarette and adroitly blew the plum of smoke into the face of the colonel. Mike wanted to make a blatant statement to the colonel. He wanted the colonel to understand the futility of withholding any further information. Time would tell if the colonel could read between the lines. Mike changed his mind and skipped the subtle tactics. He figured it was time to flip the table. He removed his M9 from his holster and placed it on the left hand of the colonel. "I want to ask you this question one time. I'm assuming we have enough rapport at this point in our relationship to where you will trust me when I say, don't fuck with me on this. The colonel was tired of being paraded around the facility like a captured POW. His patience was wearing rather thin and didn't care much for the false bravado of the sergeant. The thing about threatening someone with a gun, Sergeant, is that the captive has to believe the interrogator is serious enough to follow through with the threat. Without a moment of hesitation, the sergeant made a statement that he was no longer fucking around. He swiftly pulled the trigger of the M9 and put a 9mm round through the right hand of the colonel. The colonel screamed a piteous cry of panic and pain. Janikowski immediately attempted to gag the colonel and silence his hollering. Lindell dashed over to the colonel and started dressing the wounds. With a combination of quick clotting packets and a little bit of morphine, the medical corpsman was able to soothe the colonel. Sergeant Allen pushed Lindell aside and looked directly into the eyes of the colonel. The time for subtle was over. The time for courteous coddling is over. The time mucking around was over. For the first time, the colonel saw the real Mike Allen and was petrified of the sergeant. The sentiment of the colonel was adorned by the rest of the squad. Whitaker started rubbing his hand together and whispered with a smirk, "Time for some get back." Now, where were we before you rudely interrupted me, Colonel? Mike asked and placed the barrel of his gun on the right hand of the colonel. Sir, we're shooting hostages now? Lindell asked the sergeant. A glimpse of hope poured into the colonel's eyes. Mike decocked the M9 and started to shake his head. He turned to Lindell and ordered him to secure the hallway. To the dismay and shock of the squad, Lindell did not budge from his position. The sergeant stood up and bowed up on Lindell. He grabbed onto Lindell's vest and pulled him in close. The sergeant started whispering something into Lindell's ear. The room was silent as a library, but none of the men could hear a word. Lindell shouldered his firearm and defiantly marched into the hallway. Sorry about that, the sergeant said while pulling the chair close to the colonel. The colonel looked over to the rest of the squad in an attempt to find a sympathetic ally to his cause. Unfortunately for him, there would be no such luck. Where were we? Again, he asked in a comically sinister tone. Mike began to noticeably slow the conversation down and take strategic pauses. He found long ago that pausing was a great source of creating undue tension during an interrogation. It was something he learned working as an insurance salesman in the San Fernando Valley. Ah, yeah, I had a question. Mike crossed his legs and fervently started smoking his cigarette. He took a long puff from that cigarette and stared into the eyes of the colonel. Now, I'm no Ph.D. or nothing like that. I live in the real world. I come from the school of hard knocks. But when I see dog tags from the Coast Guard's National Strike Force, covered in blood and goo, I get to thinking, he said while tapping the ash from a cigarette on the lap of the colonel. I get to thinking maybe I wasn't apprised of all the critical, need-to-know information on this mission. He said and puffed smoke into the general direction of the colonel. Look, the colonel pleaded with Mike Allen. No, you look. Shut the fuck up, he shouted down the colonel. The colonel obliged and sat in the chair, content with remaining completely closed-mouthed. It looks to me like you sent in the NSF, and it looks to me like we're the second team on site. It looks to me like we're cleaning up your major fuck-up. The colonel kept his composure and sat quietly in the chair. He wasn't sure how to interject himself back into the conversation without spurring the sergeant into a fit of justified rage. I've got dead Marines in this building. People I would have easily given my life for. Now is the time to come clean, once and for all, Mike Allen said while pulling out his sidearm. He slowly pulled back on the slide to check for ammunition and cocked the gun for action. He flicked the cigarette at the colonel and it bounced off his forehead. DeStefano was shocked because for the last 10 years, serving with Mike Allen, he had never witnessed this side of him. Mike rose from his chair and placed the M9 shoulder of the colonel. Speak now, or forever hold your peace, the sergeant said while cocking back the hammer on his pistol.
The NSF responded almost instantaneously. There's a squad on the standby just off the coast of the island. We kept them on standby for this very situation.
He blurted out into the total calculation. See? That wasn't so hard, was it? The sergeant said while decocking his firearm and placing it back into his waistband.
Dr. Carrington was the intelligence officer tagging along with the NFS team. She had first-hand knowledge of the island facility.
Okay, so what happened?
The sergeant asked and drooped the bloody dog tags over the head of Lieutenant Colonel Johnson. They infiltrated the facility, and all hell broke loose. We received an SOS from Dr. Kerrigan about 20 minutes into the operation. You knew? This whole time? Maddox gasped. I had my orders, just like you, the colonel explained. Which were what, exactly? To get in, get the virus, and fuck us in the ass? Hernandez shouted belligerently. Not exactly. We knew that a mercenary incursion was only possible with an inside player. For years, Plum Island had to deal with leaks to the Soviets, high-level leaks of classified intel. We surmised it was Dr. Kerrigan, but could never prove it. Who else could it have been for so many years? Let me get this right. You suspected this doctor of espionage and then turned her around and sent her in to assist as an intelligence officer for a counterterrorism mission. In hopes to what? Catch her in the act? Catch her red-handed once and for all? Sergeant Allen blurted out hysterically in disbelief. I mean, when you say it like that, it sounds pretty bad, the colonel admitted. Stefano, give me a knife. I'm going to cut this fool. Hernandez shouted as he turned to the corner of the room where Stefano was standing. The gunnery sergeant seemed unfazed by his request. Hernandez slowly raised up his tack light in the direction of the gunny. Tony, he asked. Not a word came out of the gunnery sergeant's mouth. Yo, Tony, you deaf or what? He said while approaching the gunny from behind. The gunnery sergeant deliberately raised up his head and turned towards the sergeant. His eyes were heavily dilated with a maroon color. Hernandez halted his ingress and asked, You okay, bud? You don't look so hot. Stefano was favoring his hand as it began to uncontrollably spasm and gust with blood. The blood spewed across the room, painting the walls of the biolab. Hernandez was flabbergasted as Stefano wailed in pain and floundered about the biolab. He couldn't help but be a bystander to what could only be described as an out-of-control human sprinkler system. The strength was immediately flushed from his body. Maddox broke her trance and barreled down on the gunnery sergeant, tackling him to the ground. Stand still, Gunny, she said. The rest of the squad immediately followed suit and deserted any notion of personal well-being as they dove onto the gunnery sergeant. One by one, the gunnery sergeant tossed the squad members to the side. The more the gunny squirmed, the more the men fumbled about trying to subdue him. After several minutes of seizing and spasming, the gunnery sergeant went completely limp. When the chaos subsided, Lindell looked over the gunnery sergeant's corpse for some kind of clue as to what happened. Lindell held his head to Stefano's heart and heard nothing but shattering silence. He was as dead as a doornail. He decided to go right to the source and began to examine his hand. The veins on his hands were blackened and bloated beyond belief. There seemed to be a scratch for some kind of epicenter of the hand. Form a perimeter, Allen shouted at the operators in an attempt to make sense of what just transpired. He took a second to catch his breath and grapple with the reality of his best friend laying lifeless on the floor. Lindell, figure out what happened. Janowski, guard the prisoner. Maddox? Sir. What is it? Allen shouted. Janowski pointed over to the chair where the colonel was formerly bound. The chair was tipped over and the restraints dangled off the chair. Oh, you gotta be fucking kidding me, the sergeant said. Maddox took a moment to recuperate. She wiped the blood from her face and took a few calming down breaths. She got up to her feet and walked over to Stefano's body. What's the prognosis? She asked Lindell. Too soon to tell, he said while examining the body. Hernandez, Show me where Desfano was standing when you found him. Hernandez attempted to locate the gunny's exact position. He started scanning the room and pointed over to the general direction. I think he was over there by that chair with the lab coat hanging on it. Yeah, he was looking over the pool of blood by the dog tags. Ah, okay. Let's take a look, shall we? Lyndall walked over to inspect the site. He wasn't sure what to look for. Something cut his hand, but it could have been anything. He squatted down and scrutinized the scene by looking over the spot with an LED flashlight. He was looking for a needle in a haystack. He squatted down to get a better look. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary as far as he could tell. Lyndall grabbed onto the adjacent desk to help him stand up. As he clutched onto the desk, he heard a distinctive sound, followed by a piercing blow to his hand. It was the crunch of glass breaking against the skin. The medical corpsman grabbed his wrist to stop the bleeding, like a vice grip clamping onto a piece of wood. Well, I think I found what he cut his hand on, he said as he fell to his knees. Hernandez instinctively tackled the medical corpsman to the ground and pulled his combat knife out from his sheath. He slammed the serrated end of the knife down on Lyndall's wrist and sawed off his hand. Maddox slid over and shoved a piece of plastic in his mouth to bite down on. Lyndall writhed in pain and soaked the floor in an amalgamation of blood and tears. Hernandez looked over his wrist to see if the infection had spread any further up the arm. At first glance, the infection looked to be isolated to the hand. Lyndall was always considered to be the lucky one of the group. Unbeknownst to the squad, Sergeant Allen and Janowski had fled the laboratory to hunt down the colonel. They tracked the colonel like two bounty hunters hot on the trail of a recently escaped fugitive. The mercenary grabbed a morphine syringe from the medical corpsman's backpack and slammed it onto Lyndall's chest. She speedily emptied the contents of the syringe and tossed it aside. The corporal arched his back and waned in and out of consciousness. Maddox grabbed a packet of Quick Clot and started pouring it over the wound. Neither Hernandez nor Maddox noticed the absence of the other two teammates. Elevate his legs while I figure something out, Hernandez ordered the mercenary. Hernandez scanned the room looking for a superior officer. In the commotion, he lost his tack light. In a spurt of quick thinking, he slid over to Desfano and borrowed his tack light. The way Hernandez figured it, Tony wouldn't be using it anymore. How does it look? Lyndall asked the mercenary. How does what look? The mercenary responded in an optimistic tone. Lyndall was barely able to muster the strength to sit up, but somehow found a way unassisted by the mercenary. After recovering the tack light, Hernandez started searching the room for any medical supplies. Bingo, he said. He ran over to the nearest first aid kit and ripped it clean off the wall. He took the kit under his arm like a running back who was just handed off the ball. He ran back to Lyndall and flung open the kit to look for additional supplies. What do you need, Preach? Tell me what to do, buddy. Take out the drama pad and cover in that antibacterial ointment. We have to stop the bleeding. Maddox shanked out the antibiotic ointment and ripped it open with her teeth. Hold on, buddy, Hernandez said while lacing the bandage in the ointment. This is going to hurt, so I'll need one of you to hold me down, just in case, he said while wincing. Maddox straddled the medical corpsman to pin him down. Under normal circumstances, most people would find it customary for him to be stuffing dollar bills into her pockets. Under normal circumstances, Hernandez would be cracking jokes. These were anything but normal circumstances. Hernandez took the dampened gauze and applied it to the lopped-off wrist. The medical sergeant writhed in pain and whimpered to the best of his ability. How Lyndall remained conscious was anybody's guess at this point. Meanwhile, in the inner corridors of the facility, Mike and Kyle had been in hot pursuit of Lieutenant Colonel. Kyle found a trail of blood, scuff marks, and smudged fingerprints on one of the door handles. Sir, he whispered over the comms. Mike turned to the corporal's position, which was about 10 feet ahead and up to the left of the sergeant. He swung his rifle, shining his rail-mounted flashlight in the corporal's direction. Mike approached with delicate paces to observe the scene. He flashed a light at the doorknob and took 2 steps back. Gotcha! What's my orders? Shoot on sight. I'm done fucking around. Janowski smiled and clutched on the door handle. He pulled down on the handle and muscled his way into the room. Janowski stumbled into the room, and Mike immediately flowed in and started unloading his magazine.
Janikowski followed in kind and started blindly emptying his rounds. Clack, clack, clack. Mike cycled through his entire 30-round magazine, but was so enraged he did not realize it. Plumes of gun smoke had filled the room. Mike and Kyle simultaneously hit their mag release button, and their magazines dropped to the floor. Mike reached into his ammo pouch and slammed in a fresh magazine. Kyle followed in tandem. Each man started laughing at their respective overzealous and premature response. The laughter immediately subsided, and the men heard a nightmarish sound from behind their position. Click. It was the sound of a hammer pulling back on a gun. It was the sound of someone who had the drop on the two men. It was the sound of an ambush. I can't let any of you leave here alive, the shadowy figure said in the background. Janikowski turned his head and made eye contact with the sergeant. He had his hands raised in the air and pointed down with the tips of his fingers. What followed was a barrage of gunshots in the direction of the two men, like a maelstrom of lead raining down on their position. The men turned about face and unloaded into the shadowy figure standing in the hallway. Janikowski fell to the ground but managed to keep exchanging fire on the way down. Mike took a knee to better steady his rifle. Once more smoke had filled the room, but this time the LED flashlights had refracted a crimson hue to the smoke. Mike took shelter behind a desk and reloaded his magazine. Janikowski, you hit? Sir, yes, sir, he said while patching up a stomach wound. He did his best to conceal the wound, but the bullet ricocheted throughout his body. Blood poured out of his body like a broken slushy machine at a convenience store. Corporal, cover the doorway. Buy me some time, the first sergeant pleaded with his wounded comrade. Sir, yes, sir. As the smoke started to subside, the corporal attempted to balance his rifle on his kneecap. He found it to be an impossible task given his wounds. He dropped the rifle onto the ground, and it made a large thud. Sergeant Allen looked over at the corporal as the life slowly faded from his body. The corporal mustered enough strength to pull out his sidearm and cover the doorway. The room had cleared of any smoke, but to the dismay of the corporal, the shadowy figure was still standing on the outer banks of the doorway. The figure held up his firearm and aimed it directly at the young corporal. The corporal faced down the barrel of the gun in an inevitable end to his mission. The corporal yelled out, Sergeant, get down! Janikowski and the shadowy figure unleashed hell on each other, causing bullets to scatter the room like a popcorn maker popping kernels of corn. Mike watched in awe as he reloaded his rifle with a single hand. He popped up from behind the desk and started raining bullets down at the doorway. He hobbled over to the corporal, moving laterally from his position. Clack, clack, clack! Shots rang out like a dinner bell at supper time. Hernandez sprung up with his gun drawn and scanned the room. The light on his M4 started to flicker on and off. Clack, clack, clack! Maddox dashed over to Desfano's body and looted his corpse for munitions. Time was of the essence. She took what she could and sprinted over to Hernandez. She slapped him on the back to break his trance. Hernandez, we need to move out, she said while checking her newly acquired M4. Clack! A single gunshot broke his hypnotic gaze. Hernandez lowered his guard for a moment to contemplate his decisions. Whether he liked it or not, he was now in charge. I agreed. Lindell rolled on his side and pushed off the ground with his good arm. He haphazardly hopped up and leaned against the wall to stabilize his footing. He had lost a considerable amount of blood. He had lost a considerable amount of energy. He had lost a considerable amount of his hands. Yet, he was deterred. Can you fight? I'm still a Marine. God damn it. Of course I can fight. Hernandez smiled and handed his teammate a .45 caliber 1911. It was one of the few weapons a man could reliably load, cock, and operate with one hand. I'll take point. Maddox, you're glued on my hip. Lindell, cover our six. We're going to move and move fast. I'm getting us the hell out of here, he ordered the remaining squad. Hernandez stood silent for a moment, for the reckoning was upon him. Lindell was drenched in his own blood, but kept a steady hand. Maddox started humming with a sense of renewed vigor. Hernandez spontaneously began to hum as well. Lindell tucked the 1911 to his armpit and pulled out his pocket Bible. It was time to read one last passage.
but stay awake at all times, praying that you may have strength to escape all these things that are going to take place and to stand before the Son of Man. The sergeant had a renewed spirit and felt a sense of replenishment. Hernandez pulled back on his charging handle and marched to the nearest exit. Sometimes you choose to lead, and sometimes leadership chooses you. Hernandez plunged head first into the breach. His movements were methodical and exacting. All the years of special operation warfare had prepared him for this one moment. He remembered the advice from his first commanding officer. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. 10 times a day his CO had pounded that mantra into his head. The hallways were riddled with bullet holes and stank of death. He hopped out a 5.56 millimeter round from his magazine and plugged it into one of the holes. It fit like a glass slipper. 5.56 millimeter, all of them, by the looks of it, were close, he said, looking down at the fresh trail of blood. Hold fast, Hernandez said while pointing at a slumped-over body in the hallway. The trio approached the body with a hypersensitive discretion. Hernandez sheepishly stepped forward and poked the corpse with the barrel of his gun. The corpse fell over and shattered into a million pieces. It scattered like marbles falling out of a marble bag. He's dead, a voice said from the shadows. Maddox swung around and pointed her M4 at the voice. Whew! I almost damn near blew your head off. You had us worried for a second there, she said after locking eyes on Sergeant Allen. Allen stumbled his way out of the shadows and into the hallway. He limped over to the squad while favoring his wounds with one hand and barely holding on to his weapon. Where's Janowski? Hernandez inquired to the lone Marine. He didn't make it, Allen explained egregiously. Good to see you, sir, Lindell said reassuringly. It's a miracle I survived, Allen explained somewhat egotistically. So, the $24,000 question is, who the fuck was that guy? The first sergeant stammered over to the corpse for a closer inspection. He was nursing a bullet wound and some minor lacerations. Let's just see who our mystery guest is, he said while examining the corpse. The corpse was almost completely unrecognizable. What was left of the body was loosely held together with bullet fragments. Maddox, grab some gauze out of my pack and help me patch up the sergeant, Lindell recommended to the operator. Maddox and Lindell started tending the sergeant's wounds, but he barely noticed. His focus was fully engrossed on the corpse. He managed to scavenge one key piece of intel from the body. The sergeant found a pair of dog tags under the body. Anthony DeMarco, National Strike Force. Boss, what happened? Hernandez asked skeptically. He couldn't fathom the possibility of going up against another Special Forces unit, let alone another American Special Forces unit on American soil. What happened? We walked right into an ambush. That's what happened. Lindell knelt down to inspect the corpse. Sir, this man sustained over 30 gunshot wounds, Lindell said armingly. And what? And it looks like some of the wounds have started to coagulate. I must have skipped that day biology class. What are you saying? Allen asked the medical corpsman. His body was trying to heal itself, sir. Janowski and I emptied 3 entire magazines into the son of a bitch. You're telling me what exactly? That he wasn't dead? Sir, I don't know what to think. If he was infected with that shit, I just don't know. I do know what coagulated blood looks like, and this motherfucker is covered in it, Lindell said while motioning with his hand. Hernandez, when was the last time we had radio contact? Allen asked the communications expert. From who? Bravo team? From anybody, Allen shouted in a sultry tone. Comms been dark for the last hour at least or so. Well, fuck me sideways and call me Susie, Maddox said. Maddox reclaimed some tactical items from the fallen soldier and went about her business. Hernandez started rubbing his hands together, probably a soothing gesture to calm his nerves. So, we got an unknown number of operators running around here. Bravo team is MIA. The lieutenant colonel's MIA, or KIA. Just great. Clack, 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 clack. 2 gunshots rang out from both sides of the hallway.
Mike and Maddox covered the north side of the hallway. Hernandez and Lindell swiveled to cover the south side of the hallway. Lindell wasn't moving like a spring chicken, but he was still deadly enough to put in some work. The squad was hunkered down into what infamous General Erwin Rommel would call a kill zone. "Does anybody have eyes on target?" "No, sir," Hernandez shouted. "I don't see shit," Lindell squawked. The dimly lit hallway was about 20 yards in each direction. From the squad, the men couldn't make heads or tails of the source of gunfire. Down the south end of the hallway, some shadowy figure scurried across from one room to the next. It went in one door and out the other, like an old episode of Benny Hill. "Contact left," Hernandez shouted and let out a controlled 3-round burst. Lindell attempted to follow the aberration, but struggled sighting in the target. Hernandez was mindfully attempting to conserve his ammo. In the flash of an eye, the target vanished from sight. Hernandez knelt into a prone position and yelled, "Sir, one hostile. Permission to engage." "Negative. Hold your position," he responded sharply. The sergeant wasn't buying time to think, but knew every second that passed was one less second until the building collapsed. The squad patiently waited for their orders. Anticipation boiled over like pots of water foaming over a boiling pot of water. Hernandez asked, "What's the plan, Sergeant?" The sergeant was sitting at a fork in the road. He could go forward into the unknown or backwards backtrack into the unknown. Neither situation was feeling like a solid option. "We're pressing forward." Lindell plummeted to the ground like a fish merchant tossing a dead fish at Seattle's famous fish market. Hernandez immediately stuck out his hand in an attempt to grab his fallen colleague. "Sir, cover me." Sergeant Allen flipped around and covered the hallway as Hernandez sought to his injured comrade. Allen took a knee and pointed his rifle down the hallway with vicious intent in his heart. He was operating on adrenaline and instinct. Hernandez started looking at the medical corpsman's arm, and the veins were pulsating with a worrisome black hue. "Sir, the infection has started to spread," Hernandez updated the squad. Allen lowered his rifle and looked over at the medical corpsman. Lindell spat out a splash of blood-laced vomit. "Get out of here," Lindell ordered the squad while recovering to one knee. He was barely able to stabilize himself. "Stay down," Hernandez said to no avail. Lindell pushed him aside with the little strength he could spare. "I'm not making it out of here, but that doesn't mean you can't make it out alive." "Don't be stupid. We can..." Can what? I have one fucking hand. I'm 200 pounds of liability. I'll only slow you down." "Lindell, we can..." "Can what? Wait till I turn into the thing on the ground and then try not to let me? Go. Get out of here. I'll cover you. Let the last thing I do be worthwhile." He pleaded with the men. The squad meandered around for a second without a word spoken amongst them. There wasn't much to say at this point. The first rule of the Marine Corps is to never leave a man behind. For the first time in his storied career as a Marine, Mike was about to break that sacred oath. Mike stood up from his shooting position and abruptly walked away. Before he could take 2 steps, Lindell grabbed his hand. Mike halted his retreat. He was petrified by the heroic gesture of his comrade in arms. "I want you to have this," Lindell said as he handed over his pocket Bible to Mike Allen. Allen attempted to withhold his tears, while Lindell started to chant his final rite of passage. "For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will save it." Mike begrudgingly took the Bible from him and walked away. As he walked away, he tapped Hernandez on the shoulder twice. Hernandez ducked down and said, "Via con Dios, amigo." He patted Lindell on the helmet, turned around, and followed Mike down the north end of the hallway. On his way, Hernandez whispered, "Give them hell, buddy. Give them hell." Mike led point down the hallway. The sounds of pot shots echoed from their rear. Lindell was slowly emptying out his magazine. As they scurried down the hallway, the sounds became fainter and less noticeable. The squad advanced to the next biolab and stopped just short of the entrance. "Look, what waits on the other side of that door is anybody's guess. Whatever happens next, don't get poetic on us now. It doesn't fit you.
the mercenary said. Sir, let's do an ammo check, Hernandez said prudently. The group acceded to the request and began to take down their weapons for ammo check. I've got 30 rounds of the 5.56 and a full load in the 6-shooter, the mercenary said. 2 mags left, Hernandez said. 3 magazines of 9mm and training rounds left in my M4. Allen chimed in with a delighted accountancy of his munitions. The 3 operators curiously contemplated their crummy situation. They were low on ammo. They were low on morale. They were low on manpower. The situation was looking as dire as a wet t-shirt contest that was running out of cold water. Well, this is it, the first sergeant said while grabbing the door handle to the next biolab.